Tucked along the shores of Nova Scotia, Clementsport has a history shaped by shipbuilding, ironworks, and a thriving waterfront community. Once a bustling industrial hub, this village has fascinating stories to tell. Stories now brought to life through a captivating story map. Today, we're joined by the creator of this interactive experience and the historian who helped uncover its rich past. From towering mills to the customs house that kept trade flowing, we'll explore what made Clementsport a powerhouse of industry and how its legacy still resonates today. Let's dive in. Welcome back to Geographical Thinking. I'm Michelle Brake, and I'll be your guide as we explore ideas, stories, and conversations through the lens of geography. Joining me today are Fionnuala and Scott. Welcome to Geographical Thinking. Can you tell us a little bit about yourselves? I guess, Fionnuala, let's start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Fionnuala Braun, and I'm a graduate student in history and a social sciences researcher. I also created the hidden village of Clementsport StoryMap alongside members of the community. Thanks so much for having us on today.
Awesome. And Scott, give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. My name is Scott Digweed. I have a background in entomology and environmental data management systems. In addition to that, right now, I'm the volunteer archivist with the Clements Historical Society here in Clementsport, Nova Scotia. Beyond that, I am also Fionnuala's dad.
Okay, we like to have a family connection. Makes at least hopefully you feel comfortable together for our chat today. And you're also just in my backyard. I'm also in Nova Scotia, just up the road in Wolfville, at least for Scott and I. I know Fionnuala's a little further away today. How are things going in your part of the world?
Good. Yeah, I mean, it's been a little bit chaotic. I live in Ottawa. It's a little bit chaotic with the elections and also just with sort of finishing up the semester. I've been doing a lot of grading and stuff, but yeah, it's been good. Other than that, it's nice that it's finally spring outside. I'm hoping to be able to get out and ride my bike soon. So yeah, it's been pretty good for me.
Scott, how are things down in Clementsport? Busy time for an archivist?
It's always busy. There's always a stack of a billion things to do in an archives. I just work as much as I can. But at this time of the year, it gets tricky to work inside. You just want to be outside all the time, especially today. It's actually nice and sunny down here. So that's a really good thing.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is let's get to our questions at hand so that we can get back to some outside time and enjoy the sunshine. To get us started, can you tell us about the story map and the role you each played in putting it together?
Yeah, for sure. So my original idea, I kind of thought about it. I traced it back to attending a meeting of the Clements Historic Society with my dad. Back, I think it must have been last Christmas, and just seeing like how active and engaged everybody was in wanting to talk about and remember their history. Like people brought along their own family photos to compare, and everybody was just really excited. And sort of working alongside that was a sort of selfish desire to understand the town my family lived in, both as it was and as it once was. There's sort of a mystery in walking around a place and knowing it used to be different, but not really understanding how or why because you're a newcomer, or in my case, I sometimes feel like an interloper in that space. But as a historian, it's not often that people get excited to talk with you. There's usually some eye rolling. Not many people think that history necessarily matters. That's not what I experienced with the Clements Historic Society, and I thought that was really special. Um, I guess it's important to me that to show that history still matters from a community standpoint and from a like a way of sort of creating solidarity and a feeling of community. So yeah, I did the actual nuts and bolts of building the story map and collecting and organizing the data. Basically, just the background stuff to make it come together as a story rather than a distilled collection of memories that were sort of spread out on Facebook, tape recordings, pictures, all of that. But yeah, Dad, what about you?
Yeah, my role was basically just as a facilitator. So I was making sure that Fionnuala had access to the archival materials that she needed to be able to create the story map. And so at the Clements Historical Society, we actually have a surprisingly large collection of digitized material, which is unusual, I think. A lot of these little societies generally have a lot of paper records, but not a lot of digitized material. We have mostly photos, but we also have a few documents, and particularly interesting to me are the sound recordings that we have. Some oral histories have been collected and other things. My one regret right now is that much of this material is not yet widely accessible. I have access to it as the archivist, but nobody else does. And so, improved access to the archives themselves and the stories that we've got hiding in there, that's something I'm really keen to enable. And working with Fionnuala on this project was a great way to start doing that.
Fantastic. And I know I'm always interested in hearing more about the history that surrounds us. There's little pockets that are hidden and hopefully don't get forgotten. So bringing them up in an accessible way makes sense to me. I'm wondering what inspired you to create this story map? Was there a specific event or discovery that sparked your interest?
Well, I mean, it would have probably been originally that meeting, but I have this sort of recollection when my parents moved to Clementsport, walking around the old town with them and them telling me that this, like, pointing to an empty spot of grass and being like, this is where the schoolhouse was, or there's like four pieces of broken wood, that was the wharves. And it wasn't evident at all just from looking at it. And I remember wishing there was an easy way I could visualize the then and the now of this place that was busy but now seemed so empty. I also realized that so much of the history was passed down by word of mouth. So my parents would learn things from speaking to community members, like going for a walk or running into somebody at like the post office. But there's such a rich and fascinating history that would never be apparent unless you're really in a position to spend the time making those connections. I think that it's important that oral history is accessible to people who maybe don't have the time or aren't in the physical village to have those conversations in person. And that's sort of the magic of the imagination of my story map. I really try to encourage the viewer to imagine themselves in place.
Okay. And Scott, what about your side?
Yeah, for me, like when my spouse and I moved here 3 years ago, we loved the place. I mean, it's a beautiful place to live, but we weren't aware at all of the rich history to the village that we now inhabit. And that's primarily because much of it you can't actually see anymore. So we go for a walk in the evening or we drive through the village and you can't see any of that or not very much of it anymore at all. Um, or the heritage that does remain has been changed beyond recognition. The buildings and the houses have been repurposed or repainted or added onto or whatever. So when I joined the Clements Historical Society, I soon learned about these layers to the history of the village. Um, and I also learned about how much it's changed over time. And the main reason I was able to learn that through the society is because they've diligently been capturing this information in the archives, and it's actually really well documented in the archives. So that's why I jumped at the chance to become involved as the archivist.
Okay. And knowing that there were some key historical sources and records here, I'm wondering, were there certain ones that you relied on for your research, or were there any surprising or lesser known historical facts that emerged during this work?
So I, like we've already talked about, I really relied on the CHS archives as well as conversations with my dad to source material about the village. I based the plot points of the buildings off of a hand drawn map that was made by a Clementsport resident, I believe, in the early 2000s, and it was part of the CHS archival material. It had been included in a pamphlet that was sort of meant to be a guide to the town. It was a bit more difficult to get the historical and current photographs. I think that was where most of the work really happened. For many of the heritage houses, I used the Annapolis Valley Heritage Houses story map, which was made by Map Annapolis, and it had so many great pictures. It was really interesting to see how the houses had changed, and it was also a really good way of kind of plotting where things were if it wasn't entirely clear. The other thing that I did that ended up I had this idea of looking through the Clements history Facebook page just to kind of see what people were talking about. So I'd open up the Facebook page and I'd search for keywords about a building or a place where I didn't really have any information about it. And that would allow me to sort of identify them in photos or learn stories about them. What was really great was there was actually a lot of back and forth between group members. So a lot of former residents or people who'd been on holiday in the area would post photos asking what a certain location or a building was. And then current residents would chime in with the name of the space. So then my keyword search would bring me to that result. And often there were pictures, like people would include their personal pictures. And that would sort of help the original question asker to identify the space. That was really helpful. For the current photos, a lot of it was actually getting my mom to walk around the village with her phone. I kind of made her crawl through the grass to get a shot as close to the angle of the historic photos as possible, which I feel bad at. I feel bad about. I gave a talk about the story map a couple weeks ago, and I was like, I have apologized. But yeah, big thank you to her. It was challenging to get those shots because most of the village hasn't been photographed by Google Street View. The main two streets aren't included on Street View, only the highway is. So I could get the shots on the highway from Google Street View, but like it wasn't always clear what it was, or you would kind of be getting multiple like screen grabs from Google that looked like the same spot, but they were the site of multiple buildings. So it was really, really helpful to get those photos. And the only way to have it done was to really get boots on the ground.
Yeah, and it sounds like a great support system, having someone able to help with that, along with I appreciate the shout out to Map Annapolis. I know I've done some work with them in the past, and we've also featured them on the podcast. Fantastic, and we'll throw them a link as well within our show notes, along with everything else we'll chat about today. And I know, Scott, you have a part in this as well. Anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that there were a variety of primary sources for the story map that did come out of our CHS archives. So the heavy lifting to build up that archives has been done by volunteers, basically, over the last 25 years of the existence of the Historical Society. We have over 8,000 digitized photos of Clements Township and the people that have lived here in our archive, which is amazing. And not only do those photos exist, but they're actually very well arranged within the archive, so they're not very difficult to find. If you know a topic or a person's name, you can actually find the photos pretty easily. And as I mentioned, beyond the photos, we've got some oral histories and we've got some written stories captured in there as well. So all of this was pretty valuable potential contributions to Fionnuala's story map. In particular, I really liked the fact that Fionnuala included some audio in her story map. So the Jim Sanford's voice, a longtime resident of the community, his thoughts and his actual words being spoken within the story map. I think that was really helpful in just bringing the history of the village to life for me. So, and that was something that came straight out of the CHS archives.
I remember the first time I shared the story map with like just people in my program. When I played that recording, one of my friends was sitting next to me and she had like a really emotional reaction to it because she said it sounded like her grandfather, and that made her feel more connected to because everybody can imagine that like they're a relative or somebody they care about sitting at a kitchen table giving an oral history. Like I'm sure that that's something that a lot of people have engaged in with their family members. And so I remember sort of thinking in that moment like that was special that she could connect to it even though she really had no connection to the region.
And I think it's interesting that you point out of like, oh, somebody sitting at a kitchen table with a recorder. That was the immediate image that sprang to my mind of like, oh, you're sitting in like a comfortable Nova Scotia home. Like you get a bit of like the breeze coming in. Maybe it's the summertime. You're at a kitchen table. It's maybe like a little weathered. Like there's a very clear image that jumps to my mind, and I think might come to other people's as well. Of like what was their grandparents' experience? What does this look like? So I appreciate you sharing that and hearing more of how did this touch others as you discovered along the way. And thinking about kind of the other side of we've got this great wealth of history, but when you're mapping a place that has changed or become absent over time, how do you balance what is still present with what only remains in those stories, memories, and photographs?
Yeah, so for my part, I think I really sort of tried to meld the two. Because really, stories, memories, and photographs, they make up a part of the landscape of the community's imaginary. The two can't really be disentangled, especially when so many of the sites have fallen into disrepair or they don't exist at all. So, what the story map tries to do is get people thinking historically and trying to create an imagined landscape in their own heads, the same way that the residents of the area do as they're learning about the history on their own. It just offers some visual and audio aids to help with that process. So, really, I don't think that the two things, existing places and decayed places, necessarily need to be balanced or actively worked against or for, because one doesn't take precedence over the other when you're mapping memories. It just sort of happens naturally because this balance exists prevalently in the memories that I was working with. That way, I sort of saw myself more as a facilitator. I didn't get to pick how they balanced or interacted. I just tried to tell the story as it was told to me by what I was looking at.
Yeah, and for me, I think mapping history is particularly essential when the built heritage and the historical landscape of a community is being lost or it has been lost. So in that case, when you arrive at that place, there's actually no other way to occupy that space anymore. And so that's where the story maps, a georeferenced set of photos and stories, that's where it becomes essential in recreating that place because that's the only way to do it. It doesn't actually physically exist anymore. So presenting the contrast between a current and a historical landscape, I think, leaves a powerful impression of how much a place and all the peoples in the stories that it supports can change even over just a very few decades.
Okay, and acknowledging that we brought the technology into this, can you walk us through how the process of designing the story map went? How did you decide what elements to include or what moments in history to focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, I really think that this was community driven. Like I didn't pick really what to include or what not to include because all of the source material came from the community. So I when I had this idea, I reached out and I asked for like, do you have any maps of what the town used to look like? So then there were two maps actually that were provided to me, and one was more detailed than the other one, and they both sort of had different levels of description of sites. So what I originally did was I plotted every single point from both of those maps onto the story map. And then I started looking for pictures and I started trying to find information about all those sites because they had all been labeled. I tried looking for information about those sites on the Facebook group. And that was sort of where the process of narrowing things down really happened, because there was a lot of sites on those two maps that maybe didn't have any interaction on the Facebook group. I couldn't find anything about them in the archives. I looked for every single thing that was on both of those maps, and the ones that ended up staying, which was most of them, I think. The ones that ended up staying were the ones that people had engaged with and talked about. There were a few situations where there was like a post office and a store, and the post office and the store were labeled as separate things on the map, but it turns out they were actually attached. So in that case, then I would amalgamate it into one point and put people talking about both of those places within the same point, just because otherwise it got really crowded sort of visually. So I suppose in that sense, once again, it was about facilitating. So where there was information, where there was engagement, then there was something there and that I could use. And where there wasn't, then those things ended up getting dropped. But I really think, well, and actually there was one house too on the map, the rhododendron house that wasn't on the either of the original hand drawn maps, but it was something that my mom had learned about, um, and she had shared with me, and I thought it was important to add because we had gone picking rhododendrons that were bred by this man who lived in this house, around the town, last winter, I believe, and it was something that was really special to me. So I chose to include it because every time I walk by that house, I'm like, oh, the rhododendron house. So that was something where I maybe had a little bit of subjectivity, but for the most part, it was just looking at what people engaged with, where people wanted to share memories, and then amalgamating those into one space. And if there was nothing, there was no engagement, then the very few sites that were like that were.
Okay, and overall, I think you put together a fantastic story map. I agree that story maps don't always feel like work. It feels like something that's fun and engaging as we're telling different stories. And I know other people agree with me as well that it is a fantastic story map. So, congratulations on being selected as one of the finalists for the 2024 Story Maps competition in the Digital Humanities and Popular Culture student track. What was your reaction when you found out that your story map was recognized in the competition?
I was surprised. I entered it sort of on a whim, and actually sort of after I had shared it with my cohort, and my friend Patricia had this really sort of emotional reaction to it. And yeah, I wasn't something that I was expecting. It's always good to try and share your work, but I was really thrilled to know that other people saw it and understood what I was trying to do. I find that often as an academic, you have this vision in your head, and you always, when you're explaining it to people, you get sort of 90% of the way there in explaining it, but there's always this bit that's lost in translation. And this didn't feel like there was anything lost in translation. I felt like it worked, and that was really rewarding for me. More so, though, I was really excited for the community. Often these small historic societies do incredible work, doesn't really get recognized. I was hoping that seeing themselves reflected in a global competition would show that the work that they do is meaningful and it resonated with people beyond their community.
And Scott, how did that look on the ground?
Yeah, from my perspective, I was lucky enough to perceive that our community here was really surprised and excited to hear that Fionnuala Story Map was being recognized more broadly beyond our community. So when I actually announced this in a recent Clements Historical Society meeting, there was like actual applause for that fact. So that was pretty rewarding and pretty exciting to hear that. And it was a spontaneous demonstration of how much people appreciated it.
Also, we get more recognition. And again, I think it is such a great experience to hear those sound bites, see the pictures, see more of that history pulled together. So definitely, if you're listening along with us, check out the link in the show notes and maybe take a pause and come back to us so you can appreciate as we continue the conversation. But I know that the Story Map competition looks to highlight innovative uses of storytelling in GIS. Coming from that development side of the application, how did you balance historical research with interactive digital storytelling to create an engaging experience?
Yeah, so to me, this really comes back to my methodology of trying to engage the viewer's imagination. What I wanted to do was have the viewer essentially recreate the village as it once was. I think imagination is a really powerful tool. There's a quote out there that imagination is what inspires empathy. And that's because imagination doesn't involve nearly as much mediated seeing of history as what you might see in a place like a historic village or a museum. So the map isn't actually mediating your view. It's showing you imagery, it's giving you a sensory experience, and then it's allowing you to recreate and imagine the rest. And in that act of imagination, you're then contributing to an imagined rebuilding or restoration of the village that every viewer of the map is contributing to. I kind of see it like a collective cloud rebuilding of this space with imagination and with memory. And that's what I think is maybe innovative or unique about this, because historically, maps have been really used to mediate seeing to such an enormous extent. You see that in maps that were sent back from Upper and Lower Canada to Europe. You see that in who commissions maps and for what purpose, even today. So I think my map kind of pushes back against the sort of two-dimensional view and the mediation of the viewer's eye as to what's important and what deserves to be seen, because the community decided what was important and what deserved to be seen. And I think that that encourages the viewer to imagine their own version of the space. And that's sort of where this map is doing something special or something different.
Awesome. And I guess taking us a step back from being in the story map to what you want to communicate with it, what do you hope that viewers take away from the story map in terms of historical awareness and learning?
I hope that it helps people interact with seemingly empty spaces differently. It would be really cool if, because of this map, people would drive through an empty section of the road or past a dilapidated structure and start to imagine the histories and stories of what might have occurred there. That's something that's really important to me. I remember where I grew up, we would drive often to my grandparents' house, I think, and as we would drive, there would be this barn on the right hand side of the road. And I don't know if you remember this, Dad, but I used to like beg to drive by the abandoned barn because I liked looking at it so much. I guess this was only memorable to me. But, and so that was something that because I like to imagine what had happened there. I liked the romance of that. And I hope that this encourages people to see structures that maybe don't have any current meaning or current use anymore as things that are valuable and useful. Like so much of history asks us to read from the top down, but bottom up approaches to history and asking us to imagine the everyday are much more special, I think, and so relatable to people. Nobody is going to relate to a top down great man history of like counting troops and being in charge of like enormous, like having that sort of responsibility, because most people don't experience that. But everybody has experienced looking at an abandoned building or wondering what might have happened there at one point. So that's what fascinated me about abandoned buildings as a child, and I'd be so happy if that was something I could share.
Yeah, and Scott, coming from the historian side, what are you hoping the viewers take away?
Yeah, for me, like I'm a person that thinks very spatially about just about everything. So for me, the beauty of story maps is the way that they ground content, almost any content spatially. They're so good at doing that. So I think it can be difficult for people to visualize and fully mentally inhabit historical places and landscapes. Just to fully realize it in their own head. And the story maps are a fantastic tool to assist in achieving this. I hope people come away from this story map surprised and curious about how our sleepy little village here, with its little one post office and a bunch of houses down on the waterfront, conceals an interesting past filled with lots of fascinating stories. There's lots of layers to explore here.
Okay, and thinking now to the future, we've explored the past. Do you see the story map evolving or expanding in the future? Are there additional layers or narratives you'd like to explore?
I mean, I'm pretty busy with my thesis right now, but I have had some more ideas, just in terms of really wanting to see more what I can do with ArcGIS tools, to add more interactive layers to the map. I saw a really, really interesting, I think it was a story map a while ago, of people who had tracked troop movements using this like the spatial organization of
Mhm.
trenches um, during World War I in Vimy, and they had like this sort of interactive like moving of where people were going, and I thought that was really interesting, and I'd really like to sort of incorporate some layer of sort of spatial interaction and also movement through time. It would be really cool to expand it to see, as it says in the map, a lot of the village was destroyed when the highway expansion came through. Well, it would be cool to be able to add the highway expansion and see just how much that affected the space, because if you stand in the space now, you stand on that highway and you're like, how did a whole village fit here? Because so much of it is road. But then you realize as you look back that that road was actually a lot more narrow. And I think it would be really interesting to sort of incorporate those elements of space to help people understand and imagine better. But ultimately, the map is about the community, and I've given it back to the community. So they get to choose the direction they take it in next. I'm still getting emails from people of things that they want added to the map, and those will be included. People are very
Mhm.
enthused. So, yeah, that's also another direction that we're taking it in.
Okay, that's great to hear that there is that enthusiasm for it. And Scott, knowing that you're still there, you're still an active historian volunteering with the society. Where do you see the future going?
I don't know. I mean, it could go many directions. I would love to see this grow, though. There's so much stuff in the archives. There's so many directions. There's other villages in the historic Clements Township, what was considered Clements Township historically. We could organize layers around themes like boat building or seafaring. We could have stuff focused on all the historic churches, like there's a whack of churches even just in Clementsport. And once you expand to the other villages, there's even more. Key families, there's names that go way back to the loyalists here. And so you could trace those, you could have layers for those. There's just a ton of stuff that you could do. Um, One that I'd really like to have is to somehow show then and now images. Like there's with some kind of a slider feature, where you could see like, oh, here's how the building used to look, and here's how it now looks, and you could slide back and forth. I mean, there's just a billion things that you could do here, and we have the resources sitting in the archives to do a lot of this, which is pretty exciting.
That's fair. And time always is the thing that we're looking for more of when it comes to these projects. There's so many exciting things. Trying to expand to them all, there's only so many hours in a day.
I would say cemeteries too.
Mhm.
That was one thing that I was thinking about that I had forgotten, but there are so many cemeteries. Like little cemeteries. There's like 6 gravestones on the side of the highway. And I think it would be so cool to kind of like even draw some sort of like drawing on other tools, like to sort of create a network of who was living or who was buried where and who's related to who would be really interesting as sort of like a layer add-on feature that could sort of show movement within the valley. Because I think a lot of people see these areas as sort of stagnant, and that's not necessarily the case. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more resources and a lot more like imagine this, but like for every one of the 100 little villages that have exactly this, like so many similar resources, it would be really cool.
Mhm. And bringing us to a close on our episode, what advice would you give to other students or historians who want to use GIS to tell compelling stories about history and culture?
Um, for me, I would say don't be afraid to take on something that's meaningful to you. Originally, I had 2 different ideas for where I could take this project, and one of them was something that had personal connections to me, which is this idea, and the other one was not. And obviously, I chose the one that had personal connections, and I felt like it was successful. Like I said before, it felt like less work than it probably really was because it was important to me. And I've always loved abandoned and empty spaces, and I've always loved the sort of like before and after shots of historic moments. I find it really cool when that's included in film or television, where you can kind of see like I watched a film recently where they would fade between historic footage and then reenacted footage, and I thought that was so cool. So when I was able to merge those interests into something that mattered to me and my family, it felt really easy to do the work. Basically, just don't be afraid to break out of current methodological structures. If there's one thing I've learned this year, it's that cartography is a rapidly evolving discipline, and I know that history is as well. So creating your own framework and your own way of seeing things that makes sense to you, it could easily resonate with so many other people and result in a really amazing final product.
Awesome. And Scott, final thoughts here?
Yeah, for me, geography is a key dimension of history, and it for me it just makes it feel real. Being able to visualize what places used to look like and where things happened for me is incredibly helpful in understanding how and maybe even why the events of history unfolded the way that they did. So I would advise historians to use GIS to harness the power of geography in making history come alive.
Fantastic. And with that, that is a wrap on our journey through Clementsport's fascinating past. From shipbuilding to ironworks, we've uncovered the stories that shaped the vibrant village and brought history to life through maps. A huge thank you again to our guests for guiding us through this interactive exploration. If this episode has sparked your curiosity, be sure to check out the story map yourself. You just might spot something hidden in the details. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thinking geographically.